The story starts with our protagonist building sandcastles with his friend when a rag-faced bully showed up and stomped on it, calling them sissy. This upset the girl, who'd already started crying, so Seth confronted the big guy, telling him to get his filthy feet off the castle. But his words meant nothing to the bully, who was even about to hit first until Seth surprised him with a kick to the head, distorting his balance and landing his flat buns on the floor. A few seconds later, the bully bled through his nose, and the moment he saw his own blood, he erupted in a loud, painful cry, sounding like a broken Barbie doll. Hours later, the bully showed up with a huge guy who was his older brother, and every normal human being would know not to mess with men built like The Rock, but Seth was anything but normal. In fact, he stared blankly at the bully's older brother, and when the big guy almost punched him into Mars, Seth dodged each swing of his arm without fail and landed a surprise attack by kicking the guy's baby jewels. This time around, the younger brother had lost his initial confidence and wondered what happened to his own savior. Right from birth, fighting like this was normal for Seth, and even though he wasn't particularly one to start fights, he made sure to finish them. But everything changed in school, where he was exposed to even more bullying than before and fell into the hands of some thugs who called him aside and demanded every single penny in his possession. However, Seth insulted them all, calling them hopeless, broke losers who were still relying on their daddies for pocket money and picking on the weak, helpless ones. The particular guy who was insulted was laughed at by his gang members, so he got upset and proceeded to grab Seth by the arm. However, he evaded the attack and made his bully pray that he'd just be dead already, because Seth was about to humiliate him in front of his colleagues. A full-fledged fight ensued between both of them, and some of the party members were even mockingly rooting for Seth, who was by this time already in the air with his feet kicking against his opponent's chest. That small, harmless kick was enough to make the weak fool pass out. But Seth didn't even catch his breath when another member of the gang attacked from behind and punched him to the ground. He threatened to take Seth's life, but the boy quickly got up from the ground and picked a slab of stone, which he used to hit the wacko on the head. Thereafter, the guy fell flat to the ground, and this time around, his goons weren't so pleased, as they looked on with shock while their boss bled out. The angry hooligans all at once rushed at Seth, but his little fist was ever ready to put them in their place. After a little while, the ladies were all that was left of that gang, and had already started pissing their pants and hoping their dirt-poor sugar daddies would get up and bail them out. On the other hand, Seth was exhausted and panting heavily, holding his little piece of rock stained with the blood of his bullies. Hours later, he was interrogated by the cops, looking all so innocent as the cop asked if he beat the life out of those guys all by himself. Seth couldn't say a word, and his mom soon showed up at the station, apologizing for her son's behavior. The cop accepted her apology, and they walked out freely, basking in awkward silence. Seth's mom spoke first, asking if her son was wounded in any way, but the boy nodded that he wasn't. Thereafter, his mom held his hand and begged him to promise her that he wouldn't fight anyone again. At that point, Seth couldn't say no to his mom, because he couldn't bear to see that look of sadness in her eyes ever again. The truth was he didn't know whether he was the only cause of that sad expression she had, or if there was something deeper. Years ran by, and Seth got into a new class where he was still getting bullied. This time, a raunchy, wasted fool attacked him with a kick, pushing him to the floor and warning him never to mess with him and to go as far as borrowing if he didn't have the means. Seth clenched his teeth, but eventually apologized, so the bully pinned his head against the floor and warned him not to mess up again or ever cross his path. Otherwise, he'd make Seth's life a living hell. As the bully left, Seth lay on the ground, heaving a sigh of relief as he praised himself for doing so well and restraining himself. Later that day, he returned home, and his mom asked him how school went, but he lied that it went great and asked how her restaurant business was doing. For Seth, seeing his mom smile was all he ever truly wanted, even though he had deep pain and sadness in his own eyes. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden screech of cars right in front of the cafe, and they stepped out to find a convoy of vehicles parked outside with individuals murmuring. The moment Seth's mom spotted her husband's picture, she already knew what it meant, even before the man told her that her husband had passed away. He narrated how the man passed away, but Seth didn't get why his mom was crying until he eventually saw his father's picture, and that was going to change the entire course of his life. The scene transitioned to show a teacher in a classroom announcing that a transfer student would be joining their class. This caused a stir among the students, as some of them seemed to recognize him from the past. Seth introduced himself, and the teacher directed him to sit at the back, where he became seatmates with some drooler. He noticed those lizard faces staring deep into his soul, but wasn't intimidated in the slightest and smiled at them, because he remembered exactly who they were. One of the guys started blabbering on and on about how sad they were when Seth transferred away from their school, and then he tauntingly said they missed him. However, Seth simply smirked, making the dude a bit pissed, because he wondered if Seth had forgotten who he was. It seemed Seth had actually not forgotten him, and his confident claim further infuriated the dude, so his other guy chimed in, and things became a little rowdy. They were interrupted by the voice of the blonde dude, who instructed them to shut their traps so he could get some quality sleep. But only his glare was enough to terrify the crackheads, and they apologized, and they warned Seth that they'd get even with him. As they retired to their seats, a raggedy old grandpa walked into the classroom with the face of an Egyptian mummy that was somehow brought back to life. He started delivering the lecture, but that goon from behind was still yet to get over Seth and had enough anger to drive him into madness. However, Seth was completely unaware of that brain-dead pig and had his entire attention focused on admiring the beautiful weather. There was someone else staring at Seth, a lady in his class who seemed to have recognized him from back in the day. Her stare didn't go unnoticed, and the moment Seth turned his eyes to look at her, she snappily turned back, leaving him wondering if she also knew him from somewhere. Anyway, he was primarily excited to be back in school, and while enjoying the thought of it, he dozed off. Now it was his turn to drool while his blonde seatmate was up, and only after looking for a second, the blonde dude stood up and the goons were glad to have this chance to deal with Seth. The ringleader walked over with the sole intention of beating the life out of Seth, but someone stepped in the way, who turned out to be the girl who had her eyes on Seth. They warned her to get the heck out of the way, but she insisted on stopping them from creating chaos in the classroom, because that was her responsibility as a class rep. However, Seth stepped up from behind her and thanked her for trying to stand up for him, while adding that those dudes were his buddies from the past. He walked up and said he surely missed their disgusting faces, and that back then, he held back against them because of his mum. But things were different now because his dad told him never to get his buns beaten. Much later, the blonde dude returned panting, and he saw Seth still sleeping his future away like you do. Much later, a big guy spoke to the bully and taunted him for losing to Seth, even though he was once his bully. The guy himself survived Seth with a broken nose, and he couldn't believe that Seth was no longer the weak soy boy he knew back in those days. As a matter of fact, he'd whooped there behind Silly and punched all three of them in the face within seconds of them approaching him. The big guy addressed Pinocchio as Nathan and told him he was quite a disappointment for getting beaten by a weakling. Anyway, Biggie walked to the classroom where Seth was said to have been and pushed the door open. He asked out loud, seeking Seth, and was directed to the guy's seat, where he was drooling. Biggie planned to give Seth a proper welcome, better still, a funeral, so he walked up and told him to get the heck up. He woke up, and the big guy confronted him for beating up Nathan and gloated about being the rumored goblin of their school. The guy inched closer to Seth's face and almost made him pass out with his terrible breath. But it suddenly occurred to him that Seth was a familiar face. Without thinking too much, the guy immediately recognized Seth as the guy who whooped his buns silly at the beginning of the story. At the same time, Seth remembered the big-for-nothing guy he mercilessly beat until he cried for his weak brother, so he asked after that one too. This encounter served as PTSD for the big guy, so he simply said he'd see Seth at a much later time. As he headed back, Nathan the coward was quite worked up at the fact that the big guy didn't really do anything, even after promising to give Seth the smackdown of a lifetime. However, the big guy simply told the charlatan to get out of his way, and even in his disbelief, he was wise enough to let him repeat himself only once. Yet, Nathan was confused at the turn of events, while Seth simply smiled at him and was glad to be right back in his former neighborhood, with familiar faces and all. He couldn't help but notice that the class rep was staring at him again. But at the same time, the crybaby boy just hopped on a call with his big brother. Later that day, Seth's mum asked him how school went that day and reminded him to honor the promise he made to her. He assured her that he certainly wasn't going to fight anyone, that is, unless they hit him first. He headed to school, and on the way out, he was greeted by his driver, who addressed him as his boss. Seth reminded the shaky leaf that he didn't want to be called boss in the old neighborhood, and then he got in the car. But as his mum watched from the cafe, she couldn't hide her worry or the sadness in her eyes. Seth returned to his seat and dozed off the entire time, alongside the blonde guy who was chief of slackers on Earth. On the other hand, his classmates were busy having the time of their lives, making a noise until their teacher came in for the next lecture. All the while, Seth was just sleeping, and the class rep stared at him with a look of concern. Later, another teacher walked into class and the class rep ordered her classmates to bow, but those two slackers were busy sleeping, so he walked right towards their desk, causing everyone in the way to tremble, and then he dragged both of them by the ears. As for the blonde guy, Victor, the teacher said he only let him get away with this slumber of his the last time because he had a fight coming up. He turned his gaze towards Seth and wondered who the heck he was. Even after finding out that he was a transfer student, the teacher ordered them both to head out to the field because no one dared to sleep in his class. In no time, they were in their pea outfits and positioned on the field, so the teacher ordered them both to run 3 laps around the field, and whoever among them came first would not be punished for their misbehavior, while the one who came last would wish his father had pulled out. They were both dragging their feet until the man showed up in the field, so they lazily started running. On the way, Seth said it would be quite embarrassing to come last, and this triggered Victor, who stepped on the acceleration panel, increasing his speed. Seth picked up on the cue and hastened up too. However, when Victor called him a fool, that meant it was game on, and both guys were running like someone had activated the nitro boost in their legs. For the first time, the PE teacher didn't look angry and actually looked too stunned to speak as he watched these beta versions of Usain Bolt almost demolish the racetrack with their speed. At the end of the day, both guys eventually concluded their laps, and Victor was surprised that Seth had him on his toes throughout. But Seth was simply just having fun with it, even as they both panted heavily. The teacher was mostly shocked at Seth's performance because he had always known that Victor was a good racer. But for Seth to perform this well, the guy deserved to get on the racetrack. In the next scene, it was the final round of the national wrestling team selection that would determine who would move on to the national team. Some dude with a porcupine haircut was 1,000,000% sure that he was going to win in a battle against his opponent, who barely said a word in response. In only a few seconds, though, it became clear that the skunk hair was all talk, because there he was lying unconscious after tasting his opponent's hands of steel. The winner was named Brock, and while he was in the bathroom swanking his morning wood, his younger brother, the bully in Seth's school, showed up to tell him that Seth was back. Brock remembered exactly who his brother was talking about, but he simply laughed maniacally and glared in anticipation of his next meeting with Seth. Back at school, the gym teacher called Seth and Victor to the counseling room to caution them both against sleeping in his class, and he asked Victor when his next competition was coming up. Victor said he hadn't even signed up yet, and the teacher told him to keep slacking since his future was a joke to him. The teacher then turned his attention to Seth, asking if he had joined a team, specifically an athletic team or something else in sports. Seth said he hadn't, so that surprised his teacher, after all that speed he displayed on the track, and he told the boy to return to class. Both guys left the office and returned to class in silence, but the moment they got in, they were bummed to find that it was the ancestor who'd be taking them lessons for that day. Almost immediately, his ancient, cranky voice lulled them to sleep, and they immediately drifted to sleep yet again, although each guy gave the other a bombastic side eye right before shutting their eyes. Hours later, Brock arrived at Seth's school and one guy ran to tell his boss that Brock was around, and that one told another guy and more guys, up until the entire student council heard of Brock's presence. In class, Seth was still pumping cream in his sleep, while Victor had already gotten up, already set to practice some laps. As he ran, Brock called him a broomhead, not that he was wrong, and he asked him where Seth's class was. Victor ignored him like he was a pop-up ad, and Brock felt insulted, so he grabbed Victor's shoulder and asked if he was deaf. That certainly caught Vic's attention, so he shot him a stare of doom and warned that if he didn't let go of his shoulders, he'd find himself staring at the corner. His threat made Brock laugh heavily because it seemed this broomhead actually had zero idea who he was at all. Victor belittled his oversized ego by asking who he was, because even his dad didn't know him, and just as Brock called him a cocky piece of rubbish, Victor blessed his jaws with an uppercut, repositioned himself, and delivered multiple blows to Brock's chest all at once. However, the fun was short-lived when the bigger guy landed his hands on Victor's neck and began to squeeze the air out of his lungs slowly. Brock had sustained a small wound at the corner of his mouth, so he stared harder at Victor and introduced himself as the infamous Brock Chang, which was bad news for Victor because he'd be dead in seconds. But somehow, God wanted Victor to chill a little longer on Earth, so the gym teacher appeared at that moment and asked Brock if he had returned to school so he could fight again. All the while, Seth had been staring at them from a distance and wondered what the heck was up with that school, because there was another fight already. Meanwhile, the student council held a meeting chaired by their president, Jason, who reminded them that the reason they were there was that Brock was back, and no one knew why. Things had already gotten complicated since his arrival, and he'd already caused trouble of the sort between himself and Victor, who was a featherweight boxing champion. One of the other members of the council, Gabe, didn't understand why Brock had come to create chaos instead of focusing on preparing for the nationals. But his fellow members said Brock didn't need a reason to return to school because he was a student of their school, and it was his right. Before those two created another fight, the president asked Sam, the judo club captain, if he knew anything about Brock's return, given that they've been friends since childhood. Sam confessed that Brock was indeed returning for the sole purpose of getting even with Seth, although Sam didn't really know why. Meanwhile, Seth was heading out of school, only to find that his good-for-nothing driver was daydreaming about a future he'd never have. The guy immediately felt ashamed of himself, and Seth told him to drive off. However, the class rep, Sophie, was watching Seth from afar and was quite surprised to see him being someone's move. Anyway, his driver asked him if he'd be visiting somewhere again, and Seth said yes, but they briefly stopped at the cafe just so he'd confirm that his mum was fine. And then they zoomed off. They arrived at a large building known as the Sunshine Group, and when Seth stepped in, he was greeted by an array of bodyguards who addressed him as boss. However, he warned them about calling him boss, especially while he was still in a uniform. In a flashback, Seth was at a graveyard on a rainy night, after he had just buried his father. There was deep sadness in his eyes, and it was hard to tell whether his face was soaking in his own tears or soaking under the rain, but Seth was definitely in grief. An older guy holding out an umbrella over his head told him it was time to let go, so Seth first asked him what kind of person his father was. The man then told him that his dad became the strongest man in all of Korea and had never used anything but his bare fists to fight. Yet Seth had questions about why the man abandoned him and his mother. But the other guy told him that his father had always been watching over them and that at a point, he would go out just to see Seth. His old man's last words were that Seth should stop getting beaten up, because it was embarrassing to watch his son getting kicked around like a toy. Back in school, the president and other members of the student council walked into Seth's classroom, where he met Sophie, who asked him what he was doing there. He asked who the new guy was, and Sophie was worried, wondering if something had happened. But Jason told her that there was no biggie at all because he only had a few questions. Thereafter, Seth got up from his eternal nap, and Jason, recognizing him as the new guy, asked him to come down to the student council room for a conversation. Seth wondered who the heck this reverse Holy Father was, but Sophie reassured him that he was just a student council president. Anyway, Seth thanked him for coming all the way to their class, but asked if it was necessary for him to go over to the student council when they could simply just talk in class. Sophie could see Jason holding back on his anger as he instructed Seth to follow him along with Victor. So when the president turned his back, she told Seth that the dude was nice, but he should be careful, stay quiet, and do as he instructed. Thereafter, Seth rudely poked Victor, who asked him what the heck he wanted, and Seth told him that Jason wanted to see them both. Victor was not so happy about that and wondered what was wrong with everyone, but he stood up, and Seth followed him right behind, right after reassuring Sophie that he'd be back in no time. The guys arrived at the student council room and Victor sat down, asking why Jason called him to the room. He then asked Victor if he knew who the dude he fought with was, that is, the identity of Brock. Jason also added that up until 2 years ago, their school was a social school for athletes, and the government took care of the school, sending the most talented athletes from all over the country to their school. But Victor told him to cut that bull story because he already knew all about it, and was only interested in knowing why he was there. Jason simply continued, seeing that the former athletic school had now become a regular school because of Brock. He dropped out after that, but now returned only to find Seth. So, the question was, how was Seth related to Brock? But even Seth was just as lost as everyone else and didn't know who the guy was. Meanwhile, the gym teacher shared that he'd heard about Brock's recent feat, making it into the national team. However, the guy looked somewhat depressed, and his teacher asked why he wasn't looking happy, even though that was all he ever wanted. Without saying a word, Brock said he'd be leaving, but on his way, his teacher called him back and told him never to give up on sports, no matter what happened. Without uttering a word, Brock gave the most sassy side eye and shut the door behind him. On the other hand, Jason was telling the boys how the school went into an uproar after a certain fight involving Brock. one of which all the juniors and seniors were suspended, including Brock, who was behind it all. In fact, even when Jason arrived, it was too late, and the damage had already been done. 2 of the victims were national representatives, and 7 were in the national team, most of whom had to end their athletic careers. In the end, Brock was nearly expelled and sent to juvenile detention, and a member of the judo club who was supposed to join the national team couldn't because of what happened. This incident caused their school to lose sponsors, after which it became a regular school, since even the government had pulled its support away from them. However, the athletic clubs remained unscathed in all of it, and the one who helped Brock was the current gym teacher, who helped the idiot avoid being expelled and sent to juvenile detention by introducing him to a team. The full summary of the story was that now Brock had returned, and it was all because of Seth, and none of them knew exactly why. Later in the day, both guys left the council room, and Sophie was on the other end, so the moment Victor spotted her asking after Seth, he gave him a naughty look and wished him good luck. As he left, Sophie walked closer to Seth, and he asked her if she had been waiting for him, but she almost freaked out because of how shy she was. In a rather timid manner, Sophie asked Seth if he remembered her, and he said, quite stupidly and confidently, that he certainly did because he knew her as the class rep. However, she meant that she wanted to know if he remembered her from years ago when they were younger. Apparently he did, and even told her all the things they did back then as friends when they were always hanging out and were pretty close. Sophie was glad he could remember, and her mind went back to the past when they were always playing house. Seth was always a careless, dangerous idiot, but she still liked him and occasionally gave him harmless kisses on the cheek. Although Seth was dying to dig deeper into her, she was still smiling and vanishing the memories when Seth told her not to worry at all, because he's certainly not telling anyone that she once kissed him in the past. The moment he said this, the girl buried her head in shame and Victor asked her if that was all she wanted to ask him. But she suddenly became fussy and asked him who the heck told him she was waiting for him. The moment she spotted the student council members walking back home, she called out to Jason and joined him, while Seth simply smiled as he looked at her. He also had his own memories of the past and remembered when one day he was giving her a piggyback ride from the front and back, and when she said she wished they could be more when they were much older. Eventually walked towards his car and met his ever-sleeping driver, who immediately became so jumpy at the moment he got in the car. The driver asked if they'd be visiting his mother's place again, but Seth told him to head straight to the company. They arrived there, and Seth arrived at his office, the chairman's office, where his father's second-in-command, who was also his uncle, stood at his table, along with a pile of papers that Seth absolutely wanted nothing to do with. However, his uncle told him to speak professionally when at work, and Seth wondered why he had to when he was not officially the chairman. However, his uncle told him that Sunshine Group was the product of Seth's father's sweat and blood, and since Seth was his only family, it was only right for him to inherit it. Sincerely, Seth confessed that he was way too young to know anything about all of that. But their assistant said that Sunshine wasn't an average corporation and had its roots in gangs. What this meant was that they only looked legitimate from the outside because Sunshine Group had investments in leisure, finance, construction, sports, hotels, and franchises. The man went on to add that these multiple businesses were all started from the underworld. He said Seth needed to wait 2 more years to officially take over, and then they would prepare for his succession and inauguration. Yet that means nothing to them at all because he was the only son of their boss and had been fully accepted by all the executives, meaning that no one could deny him. But just then the phone rang and Seth's uncle picked up. It was a distress call, and one of the subordinates was informing him that some people from Busan had come. Before he could do anything, the people in question kicked their way into the office, led by a small man named Derek, who was the company's Busan branch chief. Seth's wingman stated that he could die for committing treason. But Derek said he didn't care because even though Seth was the boss's son, the boy was just an inexperienced brat. The wingman asked the man if he wanted to die, and Seth asked him how his nose was doing after receiving a beating the other time. Derek said he was careless and had come for a rematch, so Seth said he was spot on with the timing because he was in a pretty bad mood that day. Immediately, the boy took off, flung himself over a table, and aimed right for Derek's botched-up Halloween material face. The next day, Seth was dropped off by his driver, and Jason happened to see him arriving at school, so he kept staring at him, although he didn't say a word. Somewhere in the corner, Brock commanded his younger brother to bring Seth to him no matter what it would take, but somehow, Jason also had his eyes on them. Later at the council meeting, he told the others that Brock had been lurking around school, and he needed the guys to behave and avoid fighting him. However, Gabe was irritated and slammed his face against the table, asking who the heck Brock thought he was to show up whenever he deemed fit, and why at all they had to be careful around him. But Sam defended his friend, saying Brock was now a national representative, so there was no reason for him to come and pick a fight with them. Gabe had more to say in his own defense, but it led to an argument, and Jason had to shut them all up, saying everything was all in the past, and there was nothing they could do about it anymore. This further infuriated Sam, who said there was no way Jason could be saying nothing could be done because students previously came to their school because it was a special athletic school. But now they had lost everything just because Brock was stupid and got himself into some stupid fight. The other council members agreed with him, and Gabe said he was definitely going to get back everything he lost because of Brock. Later, Brock's younger brother visited Seth's class again, where he was drooling to Wonderland with Victor. The guy slowly approached Seth from behind and tapped him, so Seth asked him what the heck he wanted. Like a coward, he stammered, saying he only wanted to talk, but they had to do that outside. Seth said he was sleepy, but the guy said it was important, so Seth agreed to follow him, but it seemed Brock's brother was lagging behind for some reason. Anyway, he followed him, and Victor stared at them out of the corner of his eye. As they headed out, Sophie also wondered where it was that they were going. In the school backyard, Brock had just finished with some guys and was also getting confronted by Gabe, who was visibly annoyed with him. The fool thought it was a wise idea to rush and attack Brock, but he was too weak for the wrestling champion, who grabbed his foot and told him to ask God for forgiveness before his inevitable death, considering what he had in his search history. Before he could defend himself, Brock picked him up by the foot and flipped him over, landing his body on the ground. The guy lay unconscious on the floor and was bleeding through his nose. But that wasn't enough for Brock, who said he was going to ensure that Gabe never walked again. Luckily for the poor guy, Jason arrived on the scene and told Brock to stop already because everyone knew he didn't have any grudge against the school. However, Brock said he only wanted to have a conversation with Seth, and Jason told him they certainly wouldn't be having that conversation at school because he didn't want that mess. Brock said it was obvious Jason would never be scared of him because he was from a wealthy family and was the school president. But he should very much remember that he was Brock all the same. However, Jason told him that he wouldn't let the entire school get in trouble just because of him. Right then, Brock's brother and Seth came in from behind. He signaled Brock that Seth was the one he was waiting for, and the big guy glared terrifyingly at Seth. Immediately, Seth remembered him from those years, and even though Brock was literally stomping towards him, Seth had this look of defiance in his eyes and had already made a fist, waiting for an attack. However, Jason stepped in front of Seth in a bid to protect him, but Brock told him to move if he didn't want to die. However, Jason reminded him that he had been warning Brock not to do any of his crazy stuff in school. The big guy already had enough of Jason's yapping, so he was about to beat the yap out of him when Seth came up from behind and pushed Jason out of the way because it was he who had business with Brock. Jason said that both of them should not cause any sort of trouble, and Seth assured him that nothing like that would happen. He then told Brock that they could go fight in the gym because there were way too many people in the school surroundings. He also suggested that he could wear gloves and do it in the ring or wrestle on a mat with no rules. When he noticed Brock's countenance, he asked if he was angry that he didn't seem scared of him, because Seth obviously didn't look like someone who would be scared to fight. Jason was still worried about them creating chaos, so Seth reassured him that they would certainly only fight as a sport, and the only issue was to pick the location of their fight. In only a matter of minutes, the whole school heard that there was going to be a fight near the boxing club, and so they all gathered there. In the ring, Bruh and Seth took off their clothes, ready to face off, while some lady kept bugging Jason and asking why things had gotten this bad. In no time, the gym teacher showed up, cautioning both of them, and it seemed like Jason had gotten into trouble for letting things get that bad. However, he walked straight to the ring, slammed his palms on the floorboard and dropped some gloves for them, after which he offered to be the referee for their match, which would have 3 rounds in total and 3 minutes for every round. Somehow, this guy was so happy that he smiled, but on the other hand, Sophie just got wind of the news of Seth and Brock's fight. Even Victor, who was sleeping as usual, heard that Brock was involved and woke up immediately. As both guys faced off, the teachers reminded them that they should take their fight as a sport. But Seth asked for permission, and then asked Brock whether he was fighting him because of that time he whooped him silly like the loser that he was. It seemed to be the case indeed, but Brock said it happened only once, and that was even the only time he ever lost in a fight. He confirmed if that was a good enough reason for Seth, and when he agreed, the teacher officially said they could start fighting. The first swing was taken by Brock with great speed, but that was swiftly avoided by Seth, who tactfully seized the chance to grab Brock by the torso and delivered multiple kicks to his abdomen. Brock was hunched over after taking so much impact, so Seth retracted and punched him on his neck from the back, instantly sending his giant body slamming against the floor. The moment the others watched this, they were all entirely shocked, including the gym teacher himself. Seth even had to ask the man to count down, but from behind him, Brock got up and said there was no point in rushing to count or anything like that. It was shocking that even after taking such a beating that should have rendered him unconscious, Brock was able to get up on his feet. It wasn't that he was standing looking pretty, though, and was panting like there was no more oxygen on Earth. Just then, Sophie arrived in a state of panic, worrying about Seth, while Brock planned his comeback attack. He used a force and speed even greater than the first time, but Seth could already predict that move and only wished this big fool had just stayed on the ground. Again, Seth intercepted Brock's attack, grabbed him by the hair like he was his hired one-night stand, and then flipped him on his back, his head landing hard against the board. There was more where that came from, though, and Seth drew nearer with his fist before Brock could react. And then he drove that fist straight onto Brock's nose. Right after this, Brock's weak baby brother cried out again for his older brother, and the coach was left fully speechless, as well as the entire student council, Victor, and even Sophie. Seth continued to deliver these punches like it was nothing, and so his coach had to stop him, even as he channeled his inner demons into that poop fart's face. The ring was bloody, and Brock was lying passed out in a pool of his blood, while Seth asked again if he looked like a weakling to Brock. The next scene showed Sunshine Hospital where Brock's banged-up, unconscious body lay, with the gym teacher sitting and watching him. When Brock opened his eyes, his teacher immediately told him that the doctors said he would need 2 months to recover completely because he had a ruptured skull, a broken nose, and a broken rib. For that reason, the gym teacher already contacted Brock's team to let them know that he sustained an injury during training, so he would be replaced by the next eligible candidate. He immediately cautioned Brock for getting himself involved in petty fights, but the big guy said none of that mattered to him because his fight with Seth was more interesting than wrestling. Meanwhile, Seth's classmates wouldn't stop gossiping about him ever since that fight, and everyone seemed to be avoiding him like he was the devil's long-lost cousin. Even Seth couldn't help but notice all the side talks, so he became uncomfortable and soon enough walked out of class, even though his every move made some almost piss their pants. It was seen worse when he got into the corridor, because everyone was suddenly so shifty and one idiot almost jumped out of the window. In a corner he overheard some dudes gossiping about how everyone had seen Seth defeating Brock, and others wondered how on earth that was possible. But Seth suddenly showed up behind them and asked them to excuse him. They scuffled away like the pointless cowards they were, and even when Seth went to ease himself, the only person bold enough to stay there was Victor, who had come to ask if he was free after school. Apparently, he was angry that Seth had beaten Brock because that was his own fight, but he insisted Seth go to the boxing ring at a later time that evening, asking that he not bring anyone else. Eventually, evening came, and Victor turned on the lights in the boxing gym, but as he approached the ring and dropped his bag, he recalled how he felt when Brock almost squeezed his neck to nothing. But Seth had humbled this big bully so easily, and even humiliated him by breaking a couple bones in his body. Victor had to grip his gloves as he convinced himself that he wasn't scared of Seth when he watched him fight, and now that he'd been waiting for Seth to show up after so long, he was already fuming with rage. Later at the Sunshine Group, Seth was laden with lots of paperwork that he wasn't interested in dealing with, so he told his aide that he was going to meet up with a friend who'd been waiting for him. But the uncle said he couldn't leave and Seth was just bummed out. The next day, Victor went out for a run and later headed to a boxing gym for more practice. He walked past some of the awards he'd received in his career and then went on to practice with some punching bags. He looked terribly enraged by something, so that explained why he was punching with so much fury and speed. However, someone walked in to see him outdoing himself, and then he told him not to work too hard since he didn't have a match coming up. But Victor still said he had to be prepared. However, his uncle told him no one was interested in boxing anymore, so he should consider joining the MMA. But Victor said he wasn't just boxing for the money, and rather was trying to fulfill the promise he made to become a world champion, so he won't stop until he achieves that. The uncle soon gave up because Victor made that promise to his late father, who was an Oriental champion. He told his uncle that they'd soon find a match, and then headed straight for school. But right as he took off, a black van arrived with some men who were forcing his uncle to sell the building to them. When he got to school, Victor saw Seth sleeping in class, and his anger against him was rekindled with every step he walked towards the guy. He kicked against his seat as he stood behind Seth, and when the guy woke up to see him, Victor made it clear that he wasn't a joke, not even to Seth. However, Seth apologized, saying he was tied down with tons of work. But Victor didn't understand how he could be saying that when the only thing he ever did was simp for Sophie's thirst traps. He then told Seth that he shouldn't even dare to run away from him again like he did the other night. But Seth grinned and asked if Victor just said he tried running away from him, because he couldn't believe his ears. He leaned closer and asked Victor why else he'd show up to school at such an early time if he really was running away from a fight. In fact, he said he wasn't the type to run away from anyone bold enough to challenge him to a fight. So Victor took his cue and swung hard at Seth. His punch was directed at Seth's face, and as it landed, even Victor felt he'd delivered the punch so nicely. But it turns out that his punch was caught in Seth's palm. Seth commended him for having such a strong punch, but then the malicious one started crushing Victor's hand, even though Victor tried hard to stomach the pain. Seth asked if he wanted to keep going, and Victor showed that he wanted more when he kept aiming punches at Seth's face, although Seth didn't give him a chance no matter how fast he moved. With Seth dodging that fast, Victor waited until he spotted a perfect opportunity, so he positioned himself rightly and swung right at Seth's face, but the guy intercepted the attack and almost threw Victor off balance, much to his utmost shock. He was pissed and really wanted to get Seth for this, but Seth was, at the same time, ready to land his own punch. Coincidentally, one of their classmates had just arrived for lectures, but when he spotted them fighting, he already began to shake like an autumn leaf, sweating hard and wishing to be sandwiched between both guys. The moment both guys spotted him, Seth said they'd finish it later, but even though they'd stopped right before the others arrived, everyone knew what had happened and kept staring at them and having all those side talks, while the guys just couldn't wait to be done with the lectures so they'd resume their fight. Later, Sophie walked in and asked Seth if he wasn't interested in lunch for that day or something. Just then, his stomach growled, and he knew for sure that he had to eat, so he walked out of the room while she followed closely behind. Victor was still supercharged and couldn't wait to see which one of them would win, so he took a quick nap. After lunch break was over, Seth slid back into his chair and fell asleep as usual, while Sophie stared with a look of concern. Sundown arrived quickly and Victor suddenly jolted up from his seat and then told Seth to follow him. He did, and Victor made them walk for ages, while Seth's driver tailed closely behind. Eventually Victor got tired and asked if they'd gotten there already, and Victor got pissed. So Seth got into his car and said they didn't have much time to waste, so Victor could join in for a ride. Even though Victor would rather not, he eventually got in and both guys ignored each other, while the driver asked where he should take them. Apparently, they were headed to the boxing gym owned by Victor's uncle, and the driver who was outside knew he wouldn't return home early that day, if at all. But just then, the black van from earlier suddenly turned up at the building's entrance, and this time around, the thugs showed up with weapons of all sorts and made their way towards the boxing gym. Meanwhile, Seth and Victor were inside, and Victor invited Seth into the ring. But before he got in, Seth's eye caught a picture of Victor standing with his dad, who was wearing a championship belt. Seeing that Seth was wasting his time, Victor urged him to step in already, and when he did, Victor confessed that he'd been eyeing Seth ever since he transferred into their school. Seth said there was no way that was possible, because the moron had been sleeping for half of his lifetime. This was enough to piss Victor off, so he was more pumped to beat Seth, and Seth told him to shut the F up and handed him some gloves. However, Victor told him since he thought boxing was all child's play, he could try doing it without boxing gloves, and he was pretty confident because boxing was his own sport. Victor took the challenge and removed his shirt, but Victor was shocked the moment he revealed his super ripped abs looking so hot they could make a virgin an ex-virgin. Seeing the expression on his friend's face, Seth could tell he was scared already, but Victor would rather die than admit he was scared. Seth invited him to land the first blow, but he kept dodging the attacks as usual, despite how good Victor's aim was. But their fight was interrupted when someone shouted Victor's name, and it turned out to be his uncle, who was panting as he tried to inform his nephew that there were some thugs outside and they were done for. At the time, the guys had already stopped their fight and Seth put on his shirt and headed outside. However, he found his driver dealing mercilessly with them and punishing them, So he asked what happened, and the driver said they were about to attack the gym. He asked the driver who the guys were and what their plan was, but the driver didn't know, so Seth requested that he bring one of the thugs in for questioning. They took him to the company and thoroughly drilled him, after which he discovered that the gym had unpaid debt, which was why they were trying to forcefully take the gym, although the thug claimed they were going to buy it from them. He asked his uncle what they should do about the idiots, but the uncle threw the question right back at him and asked what he'd like them to do. The next day, Victor didn't show up to school and the teacher was asking if anyone had an idea where he was, but the whole class turned to look at Seth like he was his baby or something. Anyway, the teacher commenced lectures, and even until it was break time, Victor didn't show up. But suddenly he came in through the door and marched straight up to Seth, slammed his hand against the desk, and told him to see him outside. When they were out, Seth asked him what he wanted, but Victor brought out a brown envelope and showed it to Seth, asking him what it was because he was given it the day before. Apparently, it contained the complete amount of his father's debt, including the interest rates, so he wanted to know if Seth did it. Seth didn't particularly respond and asked him what his problem was, and Victor yelled at him, asking who the heck he thought he was to interfere with the family's business. Seth calmly asked him if that was his dumb way of protecting his pride, and this aggravated the situation, with Victor becoming so angry that he jerked Seth's collar up and called him names. Anyway, Seth casually told him that if he didn't want it, he could simply give it back. But Victor said that the guys had already closed up their office and disappeared, so he wanted to know what on earth Seth did to them. Simply, Seth shrugged him off and told him to focus on his boxing, because he had promised his father that he'd become the boxing champion. He immediately turned and walked away, although he made sure to remind Victor that he was always open to fight and always ready if Victor wanted a fight. Somehow, Victor was too stunned to speak, and while Seth gradually disappeared in the background, it felt like Victor was now standing in his own shadow. All this time, Sophie had been peeking from a corner, and Seth asked her what she was doing, startling her as he came unexpectedly. She confessed that she was just wondering if they were fighting, and he asked if she was worried. She just started blushing like an overripe tomato. She quickly dismissed this as part of her responsibilities as a class to ensure that no one fought in class. And Seth assured her that he wouldn't fight with the kids in his class, but told her that she hadn't changed a bit. She asked what he meant, and he said that she was still a nice girl who worried about everyone. Anyway, he walked over and left her to her thoughts, smiling like a big fool. But Jason had been peeking the whole time and was so jealous and pissed at Seth, saying he should know his place. In the next scene, Derek was seen kneeling in a temple, and the temple attendant opened an inner door, revealing Kaichu, the gang leader of the three-headed ghost gang. Derek apologized for taking a long time to accomplish his task, and the man said he was extremely disappointed. However, Derek apologized and asked for one more chance, saying that the heir hadn't been confirmed yet, and if only the man would assist him for a bit longer, Derek could take over the Sunshine Group. However, Kaichu was tired of condoning his BS and banged his pipe against the floor, snapping it on the spot. He said he heard that the supposed heir of the Sunshine Group was still too young and advised Derek that even though the guy was young, he needed to be more cautious in his approach. The only thing Derek needed to do was find the boy's weakness, because he was not yet a grown man, and so it would be easy to find his weakness. Immediately, the only thing that came to Derek's mind was standing beside his mother when they were both mourning the death of his father. His eyes were lit with hope and anticipation, but Kaichu told him to take things slow and easy and make sure he succeeded no matter what. In the next scene, Gabe was leading the way with his thugs, all of them looking battered up, as they made their way into Seth's classroom. He asked for Seth, who identified himself, so Gabe asked him how on earth Brock got beaten up by him. He immediately told Seth to step outside, but Seth remained seated where he was and asked if he thought him to be a useless dog who would do as he was told. Gabe was irritated by his guts and asked him who gave him such audacity, but the altercation was interrupted and some big blonde guy walked into the classroom and pushed past them. Sam also walked in and told Gabe not to touch Seth at all because he would be joining the judo club. Even Seth was surprised at this because he never really had any meeting with anyone, and the entire class also seemed surprised. While the confusion was going on, Sam insisted that Gabe shouldn't even dare to touch his judo members. Before long, another group of student council members showed up, one being led by the head of the wrestling club and the other being held by the head of the kendo club, all wanting to recruit some as a member of their club. Now this was a lot messier for him, and he wondered what on earth was going on. Seeing the chaos those guys were creating in her class, Sophie told them that they were making the entire class uncomfortable. But Gabe and the leader of the wrestling club both said they wanted to talk to him, as well as the judo club leader and the kendo club leader, who all wanted to scout him. Anyway, Sophie told them to get the F out of her class and literally pushed them out and banged the door behind them. At least Seth will be a lot more comfortable now than before. However, the guys came out to the front door and still bothered him to join their respective clothes. Eventually, Sophie came again and pushed them all away. But the gym teacher suddenly showed up and asked them all what was going on. Everyone kept quiet, but when he glared with his soul-snatching side eye, Seth was on one side and the guys on the other. He immediately figured out what was up and told them to get back to their respective classes. Reluctantly, Gabe told Seth that he'd see him later, and all the other guys also returned to their class. As for Seth, the teacher told him to come to the counseling room, and when he got there, the man asked him if he heard that the school was originally made for talented athletes. Seth said he was aware of this, so the teacher told him to consider venturing into sports, because Brock, who he had beaten to a pulp, was just like him when he was a freshman, because all the teams wanted to take him. However, everything turned into a huge fight, and the coach didn't want anything similar to happen to Seth. Surprisingly, the guy said he didn't even have time for sports, but the teacher was surprised, wondering just how busy a student could get. Seth said even he was surprised at how busy his schedule was, but the teacher thought Seth was messing around and said he was not there to joke with him. Seth, however, asked him if it looked like he was also there to just mess around, and he wasn't even the one who should be there, but those students who came to disturb him. He asked his teacher to warn the students not to bother him anymore because he wasn't one to run from fights and would give them his fat stick in all the right places. Unknown to him, the president of the student council was listening in on their conversation and thought Seth to be an arrogant son of a gun. From that point, he walked away from school and into a strange building, where some thugs were hanging out. The gang leader sarcastically wondered why their honorable president was showing up at his hideout, and Jason told him that he needed him to take care of someone for him. Later that day, Seth was about to return home when someone sprang out from a corner and hit him on the head with a stick. When he opened his eyes, he was facing the gang leader in that hideout, who gave him a much unneeded morning greeting. Seth was bleeding from his head, and when he managed to get up, his head was throbbing. One of the goons there kicked him and told him to get up, but Seth just glared at him with a very cold stare. In fact, one of the other goons said Seth was way too weak for someone who had supposedly defeated Brock, and they asked him to stop acting tough because he was a bloody rookie. Despite his current situation, Seth had a smile on his face and said it was a rather interesting scenario, but this surprised the guys, who wondered why he wasn't scared. The dude with the stick raised it and was about to hit Seth again, but his reflexes were expired, so Seth punched it out of his hands, sending the stick flying away from him towards the boss. The idiot started screaming in pain because Seth had broken his fingers and rendered them useless, but Seth said he was being so disgustingly noisy. And then he proceeded to punch him in the chest and surprisingly left a dent in his chest. Thereafter, he punched the idiot's head, and the guy immediately passed out flat on the floor, after which he asked who they were. The boss was stunned to the core and could not utter a single word after witnessing what he just did, but Seth was in a hurry to get the whole thing done and over with. Soon the boss came back to his senses and called Seth a cocky piece of trash, after which he commanded his goons to crush him. In no time, Seth was surrounded by no less than 14 guys, so he quickly scanned the room to know what he was dealing with. At the leader's command, they all rushed towards him from every side, but one after the other, Seth kept beating their weak bodies up until he got ambushed with a chain that was hooked around his neck. The guy holding the chain pulled on it and started choking Seth to prove that he was Zaddy, but Seth tactfully threw his hands towards the guy's face and poked his left eye with his thumb, instantly making him bleed out and lose his balance. Thereafter, Seth tried setting himself free from the chain, but he still didn't take his thumb out of the guy's eye socket, and even went on to bang his head against another half-blind idiot's head, throwing them both to the ground and knocking them out. Eventually, he unwound the chain from his neck, and as more of the thugs came for him, he was glad to have found a new weapon to deal with them. When the fools saw that Seth wasn't going to be a walk in the park, the leader commanded them to get bats. It's not like this was ever going to stop Seth, who had already entered a really dark state and was waiting for the first fool to strike. In fact, he had already gotten rid of the chains and was obviously going to use his bare hands to deal with them. But somehow they managed to trap him in the middle of the action with one guy holding him from the back, while another would hit him with the bat. However, before the bat could make its way to him, Seth kicked on his natural cream factory, and we all know how that went down for him. He later attacked the guy holding him from behind, landing 2 punches straight up on his face. But someone snuck from behind him and swung the bat directly at the back of his head, immediately stopping him dead in his tracks. Seth touched his head and found out that he was bleeding, but he just wiped the blood off his palms and had a look screaming that he was about to run berserk. Like a lunatic, he ran towards the guy who hit him and attacked him all at once with the other surviving gang members. Already, it was dark, and Seth had completely and single-handedly finished off all those thugs, so their leader was completely shocked and didn't know what to do. The moment he saw Seth, he instantly remembered the boy who had single-handedly dealt with him and his gang members, using only a piece of stone. As he realized this, his face showed the dread that had completely overtaken him, and each step that Seth took towards him made him want to die by the guillotine instead. Seth walked over and grabbed him by the collar, and then he asked him to simply tell him who ordered the attack on him. Moments later, the scene changed and showed Seth walking towards the school building all bloody and wounded. He was headed for his student council room, while Jason was a bit worried when he realized he hadn't yet received a call from the thug leader. While he was deep in thought, Seth walked into the student council room, and he was shocked, almost as if he had seen a ghost. Before he could process what was happening, Seth grabbed his hair and slammed his face into a table, asking him why he ordered the hit on him. Coincidentally, Sophie was walking in at that moment to ask Jason something when she saw that Seth was dealing with Jason. The guy looked like dirt and his glasses had been crushed already, even though Seth had only started teaching him a lesson. With Sophie present, Seth told Jason to count himself lucky, and then he let him go. As he walked away, and Sophie saw that Seth himself was bleeding, she was so worried about him, but he didn't utter a single word to her and left her feeling lost and confused. The next day at school, activities were going on as usual, but it was a sad day for Sophie, who couldn't get over what had earlier transpired, particularly because Seth simply walked past her and ignored her like she was nothing to him. Meanwhile, Seth was with his uncle in the car, who said he was not going to ask what happened at all, but was certainly going to start assigning him a couple of bodyguards. Obviously, the convoy of vehicles there didn't look like it was just a couple of bodyguards. Seth told him that it was nothing, but the man told him that his face was all cut up, and that certainly could not be nothing. Still, Seth insisted that his answer was still no, because there was no way a student would be bringing bodyguard to school. His uncle said the guards won't get inside the school and would rather just spread around, just in case, but Seth insisted that it was nothing. The issue his uncle raised was that things were not looking good with the Busan and Pohang leaders of their company's branches, so it was all to serve as precautionary measures. Knowing who couldn't win against this argument, Seth eventually gave in and told his uncles that the guards should just stay out of sight. As he walked into class the next day, Sophie had this look of dismay on her face, and when he got to his desk, Victor told him it was such a shame that he let himself get beaten up like that. However, Seth told him that he was fighting against 14 guys at a time, but Victor said that was all BS and disregarded everything he was saying, making Seth wish he could unalive him. Suddenly an announcement was made requesting that Seth reports to the chairman's office, so he asked Victor where it was, and Victor asked him if anything happened between himself and Jason. As a matter of fact, Jason's uncle was the head of their school, but his dad was the actual owner of it, so Victor advised Seth to be careful around Jason, because there was no telling what evil he was capable of. Getting into the chairman's office, Seth found Jason along with his PE teacher and the chairman of their school named Calvin. The guy asked if he was Seth, and said Seth had caused a lot of trouble ever since he transferred into their school. While he spoke, Jason had this evil smirk on his face, and then the chairman went on to recount that Seth had 3 cases of school violence, in addition to hitting the school council president. As a result, Seth was thereby expelled from the school. He said nothing in response, and the PE teacher seemed unhappy to hear this, but Jason was obviously happy with the verdict, although he was pissed to see that Seth simply smiled. The guy took out his phone, dialed a number which led to his uncle, and then he told the man to buy their entire school. With immediate effect, Seth's uncle arrived at the school with a convoy of bodyguards, grabbing the attention of the whole school. From the chairman's office, they could hear the whole drama going on, so the chairman asked him what he did. Coincidentally, his uncle walked in right then. They asked him to introduce himself. However, he walked up straight to Jason, shoved him aside, and then faced the chairman squarely. Thereafter, he brought out an envelope, which he presented to the chairman. But the man was furious and asked him who gave him the audacity to barge in just like that. Anyway, Seth's uncle told him to read the document and then they'll talk. The man got into some dumb, staring competition, and eventually the chairman yielded and began trembling the moment he saw the contents of the letter. In there, some of his atrocities were exposed, particularly one where he was involved in a few illegal activities for 3 years. The chairman asked who exactly they were, but Seth's uncle simply told him to hand over the school, and they would keep quiet about what they knew about him. The man was angry and frustrated, but Seth's uncle put him in his place by placing his hands on his neck and mentioning that he'd been using the students' lunch money to support his side chick, all because her back arched nicely. At this point, the man was sweating profusely, so Seth's uncle said to keep things simple, and to prevent the old-fashioned way, he should do as he was told. Much later, the chairman reported to Jason's dad and informed him that he sold the school, so the man was so angry when he found out that it was Sunshine Group, which was majorly composed of thugs. His son walked in, and Jason's father asked him what he did, and much later that evening the father placed a call to his secretary, asking if he had heard about Sunshine Group. Meanwhile, Seth was with his uncle, asking how he was able to process the purchase of the school that fast, and his uncle said that it was so easy because they were guilty people. However, Seth was worried that this could cause a problem much later, but his uncle told him that they had way too many charges against them to survive easily. It was surprising that his uncle had all that information in just one day, but the man said, even before Seth went to that school, everything was set. Anyway, the question was who would be the new chairman of their school, because since Seth asked for them to buy the school, he must also have to pick a chairman whom he wanted. Obviously, that wasn't part of Seth's job description. The next morning, Seth walked into class and sat at his usual spot with Victor, who maintained a weird glare at him, even when he asked him what was up. Victor remained silent and eventually returned to sleep. Meanwhile, Sophie, whose heart had felt heavy since her encounter with Seth, gathered the courage to walk over and ask if anything happened to him because she couldn't find him ever since he reported to the chairman's office. He asked her if she was worried, especially after seeing him in that state, but she simply said he was a classmate after all, and then he let out a light grin. He then assured her that everything went fine and there was nothing for her to worry about. But right then, Jason barged into the class and angrily called Seth out, alarming both Victor and Sophie, amongst the rest of their classmates. He went boldly on to say that there was no reason for him to be scared of a pathetic thug like himself. So Seth walked over to him so he could prove himself. But the idiot took off like a space shuttle and slammed the door behind him right before running off like a coward. At the chairman's office, the gym teacher visited, where he met with the new chairman of the school, who was none other than Seth's uncle. The man offered him a seat as he was looking at his resume, and then the PE teacher asked him how he could be of help. Much to his surprise, the man said he would like him to be the chairman of the school, and it was the order of the school's new owner. Meanwhile, Jason hadn't learned his lesson and hired another set of thugs to capture Seth for him and bring him alive. They thought it was an easy pass task and grabbed their money from him up front, but the moment their leader peeked around the corner and recognized Seth, his eyes almost popped out of their sockets, and he immediately turned back. On the spot, he threw Jason's money back at him and asked him why he was trying to get them 6 feet below already. They left him there, feeling angry and frustrated, and just as he wondered who on earth Seth actually was, the moment he stepped closer to take a look, he saw a convoy of cars all owned by Seth, reminding him that he was the definition of poverty. Later, Seth visited his mom at the coffee shop, and she said it looked like he had been having fun lately. He said he was all because of school, but she just looked at him weirdly. Anyway, he had always been meaning to ask her why she never lived with his dad, but he also told her she didn't have to answer the question if she didn't want to, so she told him that she'll reveal the truth to him at a later time. Thereafter, Seth decided to head back, but his mom just kept looking at him with a very sad expression on her face. Her mind went back to the time when she separated from her husband at his own request. Just a few moments after she had given birth to Seth. She insisted since she wanted to stay with him, but he told her that staying away from him was the right thing to do because he couldn't endanger the life of their newborn. After looking at her son, she knew it was best to keep him from harm's way, just as his father had insisted. Interrupting her thoughts, Derek came in with his bodyguard and an evil, mischievous smile on his face. On the other hand, Seth was on his way to school when his uncle informed him that he made their gym teacher the chairman of the school. Seth thanked his uncle, and the man continued, saying that ever since the school became a non-athletic school, it has been going in debt. He asked if they could support the school with the company's money, because he needed about $3 million more to invest in the school and make it an athletic school again. Seth asked if it was possible to achieve this, but his uncle said that if there were students that could trend on social media, it would be possible to achieve that, and they already had money, so that wouldn't be a problem. Later, the world's oldest man, more like a living corpse, was delivering his usual boring lectures, and Seth was asleep. But he got echo from someone addressing him as boss, someone he couldn't recognize. It turned out to be Derek, but the moment he started babbling, Seth simply said he was in class and switched off the call again. Derek called his line and Seth turned it off, so the man was pissed when he was told that Seth's number was unavailable. Already he had Seth's mom seated in a chair as his captive, so he instructed his boys to go fetch Seth because he planned to finish him off. At the same time, Seth finally got up on his own, and because he noticed that Victor was still sleeping, he tried being naughty and poking Victor's hair. However, he forgot that his friend's haircut was inspired by a hedgehog, so it was no surprise at all that he bled. Apparently, this was all just a dream, and he kept. After school, Seth was on his way back home when a van quickly approached him, and Derek's thugs stepped out to pick him up. He wondered who they were, and they simply told him to follow them. But from behind them, Seth's driver pulled up and asked them who the freak they thought they were to order the bus around. Seth asked them once more what they were doing there, and then gave him a phone with a message from Derek. He grabbed the phone from their hands, only to find a video recorded of his mom in Derek's captivity. With that, the guys commanded him to follow them, but Seth was angrier than the devil himself and immediately attacked one of the bodyguards with his phone. The other guys saw what happened, but Seth had already flung the phone to his face, and because his reaction time was slower than a crippled turtle's, Seth landed another punch on his face and took 2 of his teeth out. Seth grabbed him by the hair and commanded him to reveal where his mother was kept, but the guy could only blabber on like an idiot. Immediately after, Seth got into his car and called his uncle to inform him about what had happened, but his uncle simply told him not to worry too much. However, Seth Franklin said there was no possible way that he wouldn't worry about his mom, and for that reason he was going to unalive every single one of them. But his uncle tried to calm him down and told him not to give in to Derek's demands because nothing was going to happen at all, so he should stay calm. Meanwhile, Derek had been trying to reach his goons, but they weren't picking up his calls, and he wondered what was going on. He then turned to Seth's mother, telling her that he had no grudge against her, but he didn't think it was smart for someone as young as Derek to run the company. However, the woman said Seth would perform better than Derek, and this angered the man, making him call her a female dog. But then she got up her chair and stood straight in front of him, and her innocent housewifey smile turned into the evil smirk of a mafia boss, with her eyes holding a distant coldness. On the other hand, Shift Uncle had just informed him not to worry about his mother at all, because, well, you'll find out in part 2. If you'd like to find out in part 2, type Mafia Mommy in the comment section. Leave a thumbs up if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel for similar content. As always, thanks for watching.